Hello and welcome to the final part of this Field Seymour Parks Employment Law webinar to help ensure that you and your business is prepared for the major employee employment developments in 2017. So in this final part I'm going to be exploring gender pay reporting. So before we get into the details of the law, I think it's sensible to explain what is actually meant by the gender pay gap. At a very basic level, it is the difference between the average man's wage as against the average woman's wage. And what I've given you here is a couple of headlines. The first point is the Mail article, and this is essentially based on some analysis that was done by Deloitte on the Office for National Statistics figures showing the gender pay gap. And they were essentially assessing that it could take a further 50 years for the gender pay gap to be closed at the current progress that is being made. The second element you'll see there is a quote from Theresa May's first speech when she became Prime Minister, essentially making clear that the gender pay gap is something that is a priority for the government. And I believe that still remains the case, despite the fact that they may be somewhat distracted with the minor matters of Brexit and a general election. But let's have a little look into terms of what the law requires. So 6th of April 2017, essentially these regulations come into effect. And there are 4 types of information that employers are required to publish. The first one is their overall gender pay gap figures, and that's calculated on the basis of a mean and a median average. And I'll have a look at what those mean in a little bit. Equally, need to look at salary quartiles, which is essentially placing in ascending order the various different average salaries of your employees, splitting them into 4 equal groups and seeing how many men and women are in each group. Information on gender bonus gap, and essentially that's the difference between the mean and median bonus pay over a 12-month period. And then finally, the proportion of men and women who are actually receiving a bonus at all. Now, which employers are affected by these new regulations? In the private sector, we're looking at employers who have 250 or more relevant employees. And we'll have a look at what is meant by relevant employees in a moment. There are also similar regulations that concern public sector organisations. Now, the focus of this webinar is on the private sector, but essentially the regulations are very similar. And whether or not you are an employer who is affected by these regulations is assessed on the 5th of April of each year. So you may qualify this year, you may not. It has to be assessed at each point. One other point I'll make clear at this point is that this needs to be assessed with reference to each legal entity. So for example, if you have a group of companies, you need to look at each individual company within that group to assess whether or not they have 250 or more relevant employees. There's no collating of those employees throughout the organisation. So which employees are covered and indeed count towards this 250 limit? So they need to be ordinarily working in Great Britain and governed by UK legislation. So that's assessed on a case-by-case basis. But what it does mean is that employees and workers who are working abroad may well not be covered by the regulations, but you'd need to look at each one in turn. In terms of who is an employee for these purposes, it's given quite a wide meaning. So it will essentially cover, obviously, everyone who is an employee in the traditional sense of the word, but it will also probably cover your casual workers or anybody working under a 0-hour contract. A genuine self-employed contractor should be excluded, but you need to be careful that that's what they are. And you may want to review part 1 of this webinar, which talks about correctly assessing the employment status of someone providing services. Agency staff will be excluded as far as the end user is concerned. Obviously, if you are an employment agency and you are employing a number of people, then you are likely to be covered if you hit the 250 or more threshold. Now, there is an exception that was introduced to the final set of regulations, which is designed to ensure that these regulations and these reporting requirements were not too onerous for organisations. And essentially what is excluded is workers where the employer does not have and it's not reasonably practicable to obtain the relevant data. So if they're not paid through payroll or some other system where you can easily keep track of data, it may be possible to say they fall outside of scope and you can exclude them from your reporting requirements. As I say though, that is a limited exception and should be treated with a little bit of caution. So we've looked at which employees are covered, which employers are covered. Now let's look at what actually needs to be published. So I'm going to start out with looking at calculating the gender pay gap. So the relevant date for these calculations is the 5th of April 2017 for this year. Obviously that will be the 5th of April 2018 and so on. And essentially for the gender pay gap you have to take a snapshot of your payroll information. And it depends upon whether your employees are paid weekly, monthly, or indeed on another basis. And it has to be the week, the month, or whatever the normal pay period is, that date falls within. So if all your employees are paid monthly, we're essentially talking about your April payroll figures. Now, once you've got that snapshot of data, what you're then expected to do is produce a gross hourly rate of pay for those employees. And that is the basis on which these gender pay calculations are made. Now, in calculating that, there's been some discussion about whether you look at normal working hours or actual hours or contracted hours. And essentially, if someone has normal working hours, then you would use those normal working hours in a week or whatever period it may be to calculate their gross hourly rate of pay. If they have no normal working hours, then you have to use a 12-week reference period, a bit like you might do for holiday pay. Now, in terms of the figures you have to publish the mean and the median figures. Now, if you're not mathematically minded, I've given a brief explanation of what they both mean. So the mean is probably what most people would consider when you talk about an average figure. And essentially you're taking the sum total of all the elements in a list and then dividing it by how many elements there are in there. So you would add up all of your employees' gross hourly rate of pay and divide it by how many employees there are. The median is slightly different, and this essentially requires you to place those hourly rates of pay in ascending order and then picking the one that falls within the middle. So what are we assessing in terms of gender pay? What do we need to look at? How are those calculations done? Well, ordinary pay is defined as including basic pay, any allowances, pay for piecework, pay for leave, although we have to be a little bit careful there, but it's because it's only leave that qualifies for full pay, and we'll talk about that more in a little bit, and shift premium pay. So if, for example, working a night shift, you receive an enhancement, that needs to be taken into account too. What is excluded is overtime, termination payments, such as a statutory redundancy payment, payment in lieu of leave, and expenses and non-cash benefits are also excluded from the calculation. Now, there's a number of possible issues here which I'll run through with you. The first one is this point of full pay relevant employees only. So if you have an employee who is on leave, for example maternity leave, and that leave does not qualify for full pay, then they are excluded entirely from your calculations. You don't sort of gross up their pay, you essentially just exclude them entirely. And that it could include sick pay, people on sick leave or other similar types of leave. You also have to make this distinction between overtime payments and shift premium payments. So as you may recall from the earlier slide, overtime payments are excluded from the calculations. Shift premium payments should be included. So if somebody works a night shift as part of their normal hours and is paid a premium, that payment needs to be taken into account. If, however, it's payment for hours outside of their normal hours, that's overtime and it does not qualify to be included. Now that will cause some employers complications because their payroll systems may not distinguish between those two scenarios. Bonus pay. Now, bonus pay is potentially included in your gender pay gap figures, but only the proportion that relates to that snapshot period. So say, for example, you pay your annual bonuses in April. All of your employees are paid monthly. Now, when calculating your gender pay gap figures, you would only take into account 1/12 of that bonus payment in your figures, despite the fact that a much larger figure would have been paid in April payroll. So that's the gender pay gap. Let's have a look at the gender bonus gap and what you need to do in terms of reporting there. Now this is slightly different from the gender pay gap because we're not looking just at a snapshot of April. We're looking at the 12 months prior to the 5th of April, so a 12-month period. And what you have to establish is the difference in the mean bonus pay during that period of time, the difference in the median bonus pay, again, over that 12-month period, and then again, the proportion of male and female employees who have received a bonus over that period. And you're meant to publish two figures there, one for the percentage of male employees and one for the females. Now, what do we mean by bonus pay? Well, it's given quite a wide meaning. So you have remuneration in the form of money, vouchers, securities, potentially security options, which relate to profit sharing, productivity, performance, incentive or commission. So it's given a really wide meaning. It's going to catch all your normal sort of annual bonus payments, commission schemes and things of that nature. It also may capture options over securities, so share options and things of that nature. Now, obviously, we've just looked at the fact that there can be a pro rata reduction for bonuses when doing the gender pay gap calculations. A question that is commonly asked is, if a bonus or a productivity payment relates to a period more than that 12-month period, do you do a pro rata reduction? And the answer is no. As far as the bonus gap calculation is concerned, you are looking purely at when that has been paid. So if it's been paid in that 12-month period, it goes into your figures, even though it might relate to a 2, 3, 5-year period. And that can skew your figures. Past employees can be excluded from your calculations, but there is no provision for making an adjustment for the fact that your part-time workers may only receive a pro rata bonus payment. And essentially what that could mean is that could skew your figures as well. Women are statistically more likely to work part-time and therefore statistically more likely to receive a pro rata bonus payment. And that could bring down the bonus payments that are made to your female employees and artificially distort your bonus pay gap. Now, the third type of information that you're required to publish is this idea of salary quartiles. So this is basically splitting your employees into 4 equal-sized groups. And the easiest way for me to explain this really is by way of an example. So what I've given you here is an example that assumes that there is an employer, quite conveniently, of 400 employees. And you'll see that they've been split into 4 equal groups, basically in terms of pay scale. And the idea is that you then show how many men and how many women are in each of those 4 equal-sized groups, which can show you the makeup of your workforce as you rise up through the salary ranks. Now, what do you do with this information once you've got it? Well, in short, you need to publish it. It needs to go on your own website. It needs to be in English and accessible, so it can't be hidden away in some dark, dusty corner. Retained for 3 years. There is also a government website which it needs to be uploaded to. There needs to be a signed statement of accuracy, which for most organisations will need to be signed off by a director. And that has to be done by the 4th of April 2018. So essentially there's a 12-month period for employers to publish the data which they should have captured in April of this year. Now this is the point I really want to stress, which is the importance of the narrative. Now, there is no requirement in the regulations to publish any explanation or accompanying narrative with your figures. However, it's very important that you do so. And the reason being is that the figures that are going to be published are very rough and ready, and it is important to place them in context so that they can be explained in light of your organisation, your industry, and or indeed any particular pay practices you have which have distorted your figure. I've already talked about the bonus pay calculation and how having a number of part-time employees could skew that. So the types of things you might want to explain over time, as I say, is excluded. If that skews your pay figures, you may want to give an explanation about that. Bonus schemes, those that are paid out in April, or a proportion of them is going to go into your gender pay figure. Is that going to skew your figures? Are there skills shortages? Are there salary premiums you have to pay? And does that favour men or women? If so, you might want to explain that. Are there historical reasons for discrepancies between male and female pay? Have people arrived in by way of a TUPE transfer, which means that they are paid at a high rate and you've had to maintain that? If so, then you need to explain it. I think it's important to state the action you're taking to narrow your gender pay gap. It's an important part of your publicity and indeed your reputation to show a commitment to equality of opportunity and indeed equality of pay. Sector comparison is certainly going to be important. There are certain sectors where there will inevitably be big discrepancies in pay. The classic example would be a professional football club where you're going to have very, very highly paid male footballers, and then in comparison to female staff members, the discrepancies are going to be really wide. There is also the possibility that provided you've published clearly the minimum required figures under the regulations, that you could actually do some additional reporting or additional figures. And that might be something that also helps place in context the rather more rough and ready figures that the government requires you to publish. Now, what are the consequences if you don't do this or you do this badly? Well, it's been determined that if there's a failure to comply with these regulations, that's an unlawful act which could be enforced by the Equality and Human Rights Commission. Now, it remains to be seen whether they really have the resources to adequately police these regulations, but it's certainly the government's intention that they do so. The government is also going to be doing periodic checks to assess compliance. There are going to be sector tables compared. They're going to be highlighting best practice employers and indeed those who are non-compliant. And ultimately, I think really the big push behind this is not so much the legal remedies if you get it wrong, but it's the reputational issues. So I've quoted a figure here from a recent survey where 84% of women 16 to 30 would consider a gender pay gap when they're seeking work. So if you're not reporting or you're not adequately putting your figures in context, is that going to make it more difficult for you to attract high quality applicants? And adverse publicity is the obvious risk here as well. This is an opportunity for you to establish and promote your business, if you're not publishing, or you're publishing inadequate figures or with an inadequate analysis, then that could damage your reputation. So what do you need to be doing? Well, at a very basic level, you need to establish whether or not you are a relevant employer. Do you have 250 or more relevant employees? You need to consider corporate groups. So is there more than one corporate entity caught within your corporate group? If so, each one will need to prepare a report. Alternatively, it is possible that your employees are spaced out across many different companies, and as such, you're not caught by the regulations at all. Consider areas of uncertainty. Do you have contractors who maybe actually aren't contractors at all and are within the scope of the regulations? Or do you have overseas employees that need to be checked to see whether or not they fall within scope? Do you need to consider any structural adjustments? So your bonus schemes, the timings of those payments, are they skewing your figures in a way that you'd actually want to take action to try and prevent that happening? You certainly need to review your policies and processes, and that may be something you want to say that you've done as part of your narrative accompanying the figures. And as I keep stressing, the narrative is your key here. That's your opportunity to place these figures in context, to give explanation and give the additional information that's going to give the best possible impression of your business. So a few final points. This is a rather complex area of law, and this is only a very brief introductory summary. You need to take legal advice on your own specific circumstances. Highlight the free employment law updates that we offer, and if you've enjoyed this webinar and would like to hear more about those, or indeed future webinars and events, then please just drop me a line and I'll send you some examples for you to have a look at. Equally love to hear with any feedback on the webinar today, and my contact details and direct line that are there. And if you haven't already gone through, there are the 3 other elements of this webinar dealing with employee status, holiday pay and the gender data protection regulations.